Hello everyone and welcome back to your channel Nightmare. I know many of you enjoy these videos to unwind or fall asleep, so before you get too cozy, I'd love for you to drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from around the world. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the content. Alright, let's settle in and get comfortable. Truck drivers see the world in a way few others do. Miles and miles of open highway, deserted rest stops, and long, lonely nights. But it's more than just isolation that comes with the job. There's a kind of darkness out there on the roads, a lurking sense of danger that comes not just from human threats, but from things far stranger. My dad, who has been driving trucks for years, knows this all too well. He's had his fair share of terrifying encounters, but two stand out as experiences he will never forget. It was just another night for my dad, parked in a pawn shop parking lot in Albuquerque. He was getting ready for bed, exhausted from a long day of driving, when things took a sudden and horrifying turn. It was around 10:30 p.m., and his air compressor was out, which meant he couldn't roll up the windows he had left down earlier. As he settled in, a voice suddenly shouted from outside, ordering him not to move. His heart raced as a female Puerto Rican tweaker, eyes wild and clearly high out of her mind, jumped into the truck from the driver's side. The voice from outside belonged to another person on the passenger side. She wasn't alone. Before my dad could react, she had a gun pressed to his head, demanding that he hand over all his money and anything valuable. But my dad doesn't carry much cash, and being a man who's never been one to splurge on expensive things, all he had was about $60, a broken laptop, some clothes, blankets, toiletries, and a cup of spare change. Of course, he had his debit card and a T-check from the load he was hauling, but he wasn't about to offer that up. The woman wasn't satisfied. Her friends, a couple of large men who could have easily overpowered my dad, started rummaging through the truck, taking everything they could find. For over an hour, they held him hostage, her hands shaking as she waved the gun while her accomplices hauled off whatever meager belongings he had. My dad could tell she wasn't fully in control. Tripping balls is how he put it later. But that didn't make her any less dangerous. A drug-fueled trigger finger is just as deadly. At some point, the woman decided it wasn't enough. She demanded he drive her to an ATM so he could withdraw everything from his accounts. My dad knew that wouldn't end well. As a small business owner, his accounts were linked to everything. If she saw how much was in them, who knows what she would do next. He had to think fast. They were about to step out of the truck when my dad saw his chance. She ordered him to follow her out, and as soon as she was clear of the door, he slammed it shut, locked it, and tried to honk the horn to draw attention. The horn barely made a sound, but it was enough to spook the group. They took off into the night, blankets and clothes in hand, vanishing before he could get another look at them. Shaken, my dad immediately called the police. What happened next was unexpected. Within 5 minutes, a swarm of patrol cars, a helicopter, and even K-9 units arrived on the scene. The police took his story seriously, and within a short time, they managed to catch two of the trio. Unfortunately, the third, the one who had held the gun, slipped away into the darkness. But that wasn't the only time my dad had a brush with terror on the road. Some encounters don't involve people at all. My dad spends a lot of time driving through Texas, and there's one stretch of road he always avoids now. He says it's somewhere between Fort Stockton and Eagle Pass, and it runs right through old Native American land. It's there that he had an experience he still can't explain. It was late at night, and as he drove, he began to see shadows, figures running alongside his trailer, just out of his line of sight. At first, he thought he was just tired, his mind playing tricks on him after hours behind the wheel. But then came the bangs. Every few minutes, a loud, deliberate thud against the side of the trailer. It was like someone or something was slapping it as he drove. Concerned that it might be a blown tire or some kind of mechanical issue, he pulled over to check. The air around him felt heavy, and the silence of the desert night seemed almost oppressive. He did his usual walk around, inspecting the tires, but everything looked fine. Then, as he turned the corner of the trailer, he heard it, a low, eerie laugh, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. He froze, his pulse pounding in his ears. From the corner of his eye, he saw a shadow dart down the road, far too fast for any person. Without thinking, he ran back to the cab, jumped in, and sped off, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. He didn't stop until daylight, too terrified to even look back. The final straw came about 15 miles later. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, he saw it. A figure standing on the side of the road, arms crossed, staring at him as he sped past. It was human-like, but something about it was off. Its presence filled him with a deep, primal fear, the kind that settles in your bones and stays there. Later, when he told me about the encounter, he referred to it as a skinwalker, a creature from Navajo legend known for its ability to shape-shift and cause harm to those it encounters. Whether that's what it really was, I don't know. But what I do know is that my dad never drives that road anymore. He avoids it like the plague, and whenever he talks about that night, there's a tremble in his voice that tells me he saw something he truly cannot explain. In the world of truck driving, there are plenty of dangers on the road, robberies, accidents, breakdowns. But sometimes the most terrifying experiences come from the things you can't see, the things that follow you in the dark and slip away just as you turn your head. My dad has seen his fair share of both, and these are the stories that have stuck with him. The road is long and it's full of shadows, some of them human, some of them not. And out there in the vast emptiness of the highways, you never know what's waiting for you just around the bend. I had always prided myself on being a rational, no-nonsense kind of person. The kind of person who looked for logical explanations in any situation, especially in my line of work, building and maintaining IT infrastructure. Hospitals in particular were places where reason and logic reigned. Everything had to be precise, orderly, and accounted for. That's why the night I spent in an old deserted ward constructing a cabinet for the hospital's IT department still haunts me to this day. The hospital was huge, one of those older buildings that had been renovated so many times that some parts of it felt like a labyrinth. On this particular night, I was tasked with building a new cabinet for the IT department servers in an unused ward. It was around 11 p.m. when I arrived, and the ward was completely deserted. All the patients were located 3 floors below in the main part of the hospital, and this section was completely closed off. The only access to the ward was through a set of heavy, locked double doors that required an RFID smart card to open from the inside. No one could get in or out without one. Once you were inside, the doors locked automatically behind you, requiring the same smart card to exit. I had my card clipped securely to my belt, and as far as I knew, I was the only person authorized to be in that area at the time. The layout of the ward was pretty straightforward. An empty open space, no beds, no equipment, just me, my tools, and the cabinet I was building in the small IT cupboard. The door to the cupboard was propped open with a fire extinguisher to keep the space well ventilated while I worked. It was quiet, eerily quiet. The kind of silence that you only get in hospitals late at night when the usual hustle and bustle has long faded, and the air seems thick with the weight of past stories, tragedies, and lives that had passed through. I tried not to think about it, focusing on the task at hand. Installing a UPS uninterruptible power supply into the cabinet was no easy job. It was bulky, heavy, and awkward to maneuver. As I hoisted the UPS into the rack, I heard the door to the cupboard shut behind me. It startled me for a moment, but I quickly brushed it off, thinking I must have accidentally kicked the fire extinguisher that had been holding the door open. I finished securing the UPS and turned around, preparing to prop the door back open. but the fire extinguisher was gone. I blinked, confused. Surely I had just knocked it over, or maybe it had rolled somewhere. I looked around the small cupboard, stepping out into the open ward, expecting to find it nearby. The corridor stretched out empty and silent, the fluorescent lights casting long, sterile shadows across the floor. But there was no sign of the extinguisher, no clattering sound, no trace of movement. It was just gone. I blinked, confused. Surely I had just knocked it over, or maybe it had rolled somewhere. I looked around the small cupboard, stepping out into the open ward, expecting to find it nearby. The corridor stretched out empty and silent, the fluorescent lights casting long, sterile shadows across the floor. But there was no sign of the extinguisher, no clattering sound, no trace of movement. It was just gone. That's when the sense of unease set in. This wasn't right. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. I started to question myself. Did someone else have access to the ward? Was there someone messing with me? I quickly grabbed my phone and called hospital security. I explained the situation, that I might not be alone and that someone could be in the ward with me, possibly armed with a fire extinguisher. They told me to stay where I was while they checked the cameras. The minutes dragged on as I waited for a response, each one feeling heavier than the last. There was no sound, no footsteps, no indication that anyone else was there. And yet the fire extinguisher was missing, and the door had closed on its own. My mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe someone had spoofed the RFID system and gained access. Maybe they had slipped in earlier without me noticing. Or maybe it was just some freak accident and I was overreacting. Finally, security called back. "You're not going to believe this," the voice on the other end said, clearly shaken. We checked the footage and, well, we saw something. Something blurry. Some kind of object, I guess. It swooped in, grabbed the extinguisher, and then ran off down the hallway to the left. "What kind of object?" I asked, my heart now pounding in my chest. It's hard to say. It was fast, but it was big enough to show up on the cameras. Thing is, there are only 2 exits from that ward, and both require RFID access. We checked the logs. There was an entry around the same time the extinguisher disappeared, but there's no record of anyone else being authorized to be in there. I stood there, dumbfounded. I knew my smart card was still clipped to my belt. I hadn't let anyone in, and there were no other workers scheduled for that night. Whoever, or whatever, had taken the extinguisher had somehow bypassed the RFID system or had access to another card. The thought of it made my skin crawl. After the security guards arrived, we searched the entire ward, but there was no sign of the extinguisher or anyone else. The place was as empty as it had been when I first arrived. It was as though the fire extinguisher had vanished into thin air. Before I left the hospital that night, I asked security to run the access control logs again, just to double check. Sure enough, there was an entry. Someone had accessed the ward around the same time the door had closed on me. But no one could explain how or why. The cameras showed the blurry figure, but no clear image, no definitive proof of what had happened. I never got an answer. Eventually, I left that job and moved on to other projects, but the experience stayed with me. I've tried to rationalize it countless times since then. Perhaps a malfunction in the system, maybe a prank by someone with access I didn't know about, but there's a part of me that